we look at, again, the biblical Hebrew calendar and realize that after the spring feast are fulfilled, in the month of Siwan, which is the Feast of Shavuot, then we have 4 months to come to the fall feast. And the month of Tishri is the 7th or the Sabbath month. Remember, Siwan is the 3rd month. Now we come to the 7th month, after the 4 months. Now, when we come to the month of Tishri, the first day of the month is the Day of Trumpets. And that begins the Sabbath month of the feast. But really, the preparation for this begins much before then. Because we know once the first comes, then we know 10 days later is the Day of Atonement. And then the day after the Day of Atonement, if you're living up in the north area, you must leave right then in order to get up to Jerusalem by the 14th so that you can build a sukkah, a tabernacle, a manger in which you are to live for 7 days. You must get there beforehand, and when you come up to the feast, you bring 1/10 of all of your increase of the harvest that year. You bring it up in wagons, or you sell it, and you put the money in your hand, and you bring the money up with you, and you take care of the poor, the widows, the orphans, and the Levites who have no inheritance in the land. That is when you took care of your tithe responsibility each time you went up to the feast. And you were responsible to find a poor person. You were responsible to find widows and orphans. You were responsible to find the Levites who have no inheritance in the land and are living to teach the Word of God to God's people. It was not that you took your tithe up into a place called the storehouse, which is not really something that exists in Jerusalem. See how people use that verse where it speaks of bring all the tithes into the storehouse that there be meat in my house? And prove me now herewith, saith the Lord host, if I will not pour out a blessing, that there will not be room enough to receive it. What they try to, in the Western Gentile church, they try to fabricate a concept in which there is a storehouse, probably up on the Temple Mount. It says storehouse right on it, etched in stone, and you're required to bring all of your tithe in to put it in that storehouse. Why you would have to do that is because you are spiritually not capable of finding widows and orphans and Levites who have no inheritance in the land. So you have to take it all and put it there. And those who are spiritually mature then can take your tithe and do the right thing with it as they build crystal cathedrals in honor in their glorious preaching ability. Or they can buy their own Rolls Royces and jets and wear their diamond Rolex on their television show. But you must put it here, because if you don't, God is going to curse you with a curse. He's going to give you cancer. He's going to kill you early. These are the kind of things that are taught by that. But there is no such place in Jerusalem or Israel as the storehouse that you take all your tithe to. The storehouse is the prophet pointing right back to the Torah, because the storehouse is you give to the poor, the widows, the orphans, and the Levites have no inheritance, and you are loaning to God, and God will repay you. That is the storehouse. The storehouse is in the Torah. It tells you what you're to do with your tithe. And this is the very issue that the Messiah dealt with. Remember, he took, so many times, he took us right to Judgment Day in the parables. Why to Judgment Day? Because at that point, there's no way you can change it. There's no recourse. It is Judgment Day. You will be judged for what you've done. And this man comes before him and says, Lord, haven't I done wonderful things in your name? Haven't I cast out demons in your name? Haven't I raised the dead? I've done many mighty, wonderful works in your name. And he said, hold on just a minute, buddy. I was naked, and you never gave me anything to wear. I was cold, and you never gave me a blanket to warm myself. I was starving, and you never gave me any food. I was in prison, not because I did anything wrong, but because I was doing what was right. And they imprisoned me, and you never came to comfort me. I was hungry, and you never fed me. And the man said, whoa, just a minute, Lord. When did I see you like that? I checked the green room before every television show, and there was always plenty for our guests. And he said, because you didn't take care of these. I told you specifically to take care of the poor, the widows and the orphans and the Levites who have no inheritance, and you didn't do it. Instead, you launched off on your own thing, started building your own egocentric religion, and you never did what I told you to do. Now get out of my sight. You don't know me, and I don't know you. Real harsh, real hard. Why did he do it? Because now we have the opportunity to change. We can change things now. And it is at this time that when we go up to the feast, that's what we take care of. And that's why in America we have the welfare system in the state that it is today. Because the believers did not do what they were supposed to do. And so the government had to step in. There are only 613 commandments in the Torah. And not all those apply to any one individual. But you know how many commandments there are in the United States? 2.4 million. Because, God gives us the opportunity to govern ourselves by the Scriptures. And that's what John Adams said. Man will either govern himself righteously according to the Scriptures, or he has to be governed by the sword. One of the two. You have to have a police state for those who refuse to govern themselves. And so, this is the time of year in which we go up to the feast. And in order to go up to the feast, what we have to do is bring the harvest in before this period of time. And so what happens in the month of Elul, as you see, when the first sliver of the new moon appears for the 6th month, the month of Elul, that's when the harvest starts. Very slowly at that time, but by the mid-month, that is when we're working very diligently out in the fields, bringing in the harvest, because we've got to have it in, we have to have it processed, we have to have it stored, and we have to set aside a tenth and to have it up at Jerusalem exactly 1 month later. So it's a lot of work right now. And so while we're bringing in the harvest, then as the moon begins to wane at the end of the month of Elul, the men are out in the field bringing the harvest, the women are processing, they're at the millstone grinding. And now as the moon begins to wane, we know that when the first sliver of the new moon appears, it will be the day of trumpets. It will be Yom Teruah, it'll be a high Sabbath. And so what we do as the moon wanes, then we stop what we're doing. We get out of the fields, we go home. We take our garments and we take a set of garments and we wash them. We bleach them out. We set them out in the sun and get them as white as we possibly can. We then iron them all out, stretch them all out, fold them up so that they are pressed, and we set them aside and get ready because we have a high Sabbath coming. And then the women will prepare a feast and get all the provisions necessary and set all that aside. And then they will get back at the millstone grinding. So we're out in the fields. We're bringing in the sheaves. We are at the millstone grinding. And then, just as the moon wanes and there is no moon, and we're watching and waiting, we're covering up the sun just as the sun goes down over the horizon at Jerusalem. And when we see the first sliver of the new moon, that's when men in and around Jerusalem who are out in the fields, still after the sun goes down, bringing in the harvest, then they will stop. They will rush up to the Temple Mount. And when they arrive at the Temple Mount, the gate is already closed because the sun is down, and so they call out to the temple guard, "We have sighted the new moon." And then the temple guard, then when he sees that there are at least 2 witnesses, then he goes up to the Temple Mount and calls for one of the members of the Sanhedrin, one of the elders of Israel. And one of those elders then come down, they go out the gate, and they interview those 2 men who have come up. When he knows that he has 2 who have sighted the new moon and have verifiable witnesses, then he goes up and assembles all the elders in the hall of hewn stone adjacent to the temple, and he calls the high priest and calls out to him and saying that we have the 2 witnesses. The high priest stands up on the Temple Mount. He is the only one who has authority over the gate after the sun has set, and the high priest stands up on the Temple Mount and calls out to those 2 witnesses, "Come up hither! Come up here!" And those 2 witnesses ascend up before the high priest and elders, They give their reckoning of the first sliver of the new moon, and the high priest, right then, when both of them give the identical witness, he cries out, "Sound the shofars! Sound the trumpets!" And the trumpets blast from Mount Moriah, and across the Kidron Valley Bridge over on the Mount of Olives, a sentry who is standing there with a torch in his hand puts it to a pile of wood. A pillar of fire goes up into the heavens. And as that pillar of fire goes up, the distant sentries across the mountains, throughout the hilltops of Israel, they see that distant fire that is lit. And they put a torch to their pile of wood. And that fire goes up. They blow the shofars. It is Rosh Chodesh. It is a sanctification of the new moon. And right that moment when that trumpet sounds, it is a high Sabbath. A high Sabbath. That means that every transaction in the land of Israel immediately and abruptly stops right at that moment. Every store closes. Everyone immediately stops their work right at that very moment. At the moment that that first trumpet sounds from the Temple Mount, at that very moment, it is a high holy Sabbath. Everything stops in the land of Israel. Those men who are out in the fields bringing the harvest, if there are 50 Jewish men out in the fields bringing the harvest with 50 Gentiles, at that moment that trumpet sounds, those 50 men will leave the fields. They will take their plowshares, hang them up. They will then go home, wash, put on their white garments, which have been set aside in waiting for this very moment. The women who are processing at the millstone and are grinding away, 50 Jewish women with 50 Gentile women. As soon as that trumpet sounds, those Gentile women keep working away because it's nothing to them. But to those Jewish women, for centuries, they have known when that trumpet sounds, they stop what they're doing. They go home, they wash, they put on those white garments which have been prepared ahead of time, and they bring out that feast. It is the feast of the Lord, the day of trumpets. It is Yom Teruah, that day which is the feast that every year occurs on a day and hour that no man knows. If you have not prepared in advance, if you have not washed your garments and set them aside, when that trumpet sounds, it's too late. You have missed it. You have missed the feast, and there's no way you can get ready now. It is over with. Does that sound at all familiar?